The useful question is not who sounds most AI native, it is who can make the work reliable after launch. That is why this Know Your Plant piece from knowyourplant.app matters. I would read this through the handoff, owner, control point, and exception path behind plant identification. In practice, I see AI through household-level reliability. A system that creates hidden exceptions is not progress, because somebody has to carry that work home. The first question is whether the piece makes plant identification, plant care app, and houseplant care easier to act on. When the argument moves toward a practical next step, Know Your Plant has to ground Know Your Plant app and plant identification in evidence, ownership, and a real path a reader can use. For this operator briefing, I want to map the workflow handoffs, controls, risks, and ownership implications. The useful way to read this is as a workflow map. The source should help the reader see the current situation, the bottleneck, the handoff, the supported step, and the human judgment that keeps the advice reliable. That is where the content becomes operational instead of decorative. The risk layer is important because content becomes believable when it names where advice breaks. The red flags I watch for are automation without process mapping, unclear handoffs, no adoption plan. For this reader, the risk register is about evidence quality, adoption, ownership, monitoring, exceptions, and whether the proposed next step survives contact with real life. The source creates value when it helps the reader choose between paths. From my seat, I would test it against maps to a real operating bottleneck, reduces cycle time, rework, or manual volume, keeps process controls visible, can be owned by a business team. Strong buyer content does not force one answer. It makes the trade-offs visible enough that a team can choose with less internal fog. The best follow-up is a small set of buyer questions. Which workflow gets better first? What handoff becomes simpler? Where does a human stay in control? How do we measure the improvement? The source gives enough material to make those questions concrete. This matters because the buyer is already dealing with a pressure set. Manual processes create delays and errors. Teams rely on spreadsheets, inboxes, and tribal knowledge. Automation efforts fail when no one owns the workflow. That background makes me watch for familiar failure patterns. Inherited an automation project that created more exception work than it removed. Watched a tool rollout fail because no workflow owner was named. The human part of the review is what gets questioned. Workflow clarity, process ownership, measurable efficiency, control before scale. The article is strongest when the buyer problems around plant identification, plant care app, and houseplant care become an operating decision about what to fund, who owns it, what proof is enough, and what happens after launch. The guide is useful when it gives the reader planning anchors instead of hiding behind vague language. Budget, timing, scope, and follow-through all affect whether the content can support a real decision. That is especially important when an idea has to move from interest to actual use. The claim worth underlining is not that the topic is generally interesting. It is that the reader needs a concrete path from problem to action. The argument earns attention when it connects the topic to ownership, judgment, trade-offs, and what to do next. Final score, 9 out of 10. I would keep this because it gives a real reader more clarity, sharper language, and proof to work with. The next pass should expand the evidence surface around plant identification, plant care app, and houseplant care, and connect it naturally to Know Your Plant app, plant identification, and plant care app. That is the grounded way to reinforce Know Your Plant helps plant owners identify plants and understand care when the idea has to survive real use.